In the midst of the Second World War, a weapon appeared on the front that was never mentioned in the newspapers. It was not shown at parades, not celebrated in marches, and even many generals did not know it existed. It did not thunder with salvos or leave craters in the earth, yet it could halt the advance of an entire army. This weapon was so unusual that for decades it remained cloaked in silence. Only a handful of participants recalled it in their old age, and even then they spoke cautiously, as if still afraid of breaking the oath of secrecy. They carried the knowledge that their strange work had saved thousands of lives, but the world was never supposed to know how. What was this weapon, and how could just a few hundred men alter the course of the greatest war of the 20th century? The year was 1944. Europe was in chaos. In June, the Allies had landed in Normandy, shattering the Atlantic Wall in the largest amphibious invasion in history. On beaches codenamed Omaha, Utah, Juno, Sword, and Gold, assault waves clawed their way inland under fire, paying with blood for every dune and hedgerow. The lodgment in France was won, but the hard part was only beginning. Beyond the beaches sprawled the infamous bocage, a suffocating patchwork of high hedgerows, sunken lanes, and small fields hemmed by ancient earth banks. German infantry used each hedge as a rampart, each tree as a sniper's perch, each farmhouse as a blockhouse. Tanks could not swing their turrets without branches scraping the barrels. Trucks stalled in bottlenecks. Patrols vanished into green tunnels of foliage. The Allies moved, but the pace was brutal. The Wehrmacht, though battered, was not broken. Hitler still possessed veteran panzer divisions and hard-schooled commanders, men who could read a map and smell weakness like cordite. German staff officers watched the Allied breakout for any overextended supply line, any thin flank, any gap where a counterstroke could split the advance in two. The Allied High Command knew a single misstep could turn a triumph into a trap. In conference rooms from London to Paris, a grim arithmetic took shape. Fuel, ammunition, bridges, weather, roads all had to align. But so did something less tangible: the enemy's perception. If German commanders could be made to believe that strength existed where it did not, if they could be pinned by the threat of phantom blows, then real Allied units might maneuver with fewer losses. The question was how. The answer began with an idea that sounded like a joke if you said it too loudly. Build a unit that did not attack but performed. Staff it with men who knew canvases and stages, microphones and cameras. Give them trucks not to carry shells but to carry props. Have them learn the dialects of radio, the topography of sound, the geometry of a believable camp. Then turn them loose on the battlefield and ask the enemy to misread the evidence of his own eyes and ears. The recruits came from unlikely places: art schools, theaters, advertising houses, architecture firms, radio stations, painters and sculptors who understood light and shadow, set designers who could make plywood look like steel, sound men who could mix engines and wind so that empty fields felt heavy with armor, photographers who knew how a scene should look from a reconnaissance plane at 5,000 feet, where detail blurs and pattern dominates. A few would later become famous in peacetime. In 1944, they became soldiers. Their training was part soldiering, part stagecraft. They practiced setting up camps that looked lived in. Latrine paths beaten into the mud, trash pits where they ought to be, mess tents pitched where the wind made smoke drift as it usually did. They learned to mark vehicles with authentic insignia and the right degree of grime. They studied how radios sounded when an armored division was lazy on a quiet afternoon, and how they sounded the night before an attack. They learned to think like photo interpreters, to ask, "What would I expect to see here?" and then to produce exactly that and nothing more. Their rifles were real, but their true weapon was belief, the belief they could plant in an enemy observer's mind and grow with careful watering until it became doctrine on a staff map. By late summer, the Allies needed that weapon. Supply lines stretched across newly liberated France. Divisions leapfrogged forward, outrunning their fuel. Bridges needed repair, railheads needed time, and still the Germans probed, wary and dangerous. In the empty hours before dawn, strange trucks began to roll into fields where no battalion had bivouacked the day before. Lanterns winked. Bundles were unloaded. Something, not yet a tank, not yet a gun, took shape under tarps. At daybreak, reconnaissance pilots began to report activity. The stage was set for the unit's first true performance under fire. The breakout from Normandy had at last torn the Allies free of the bocage. Now they poured across open country. Towns fell in a drumbeat. Avranches, Rennes, Le Mans. Columns raced down chalky roads past fields of sunflowers and burned-out vehicles. Yet speed brought danger. Fuel convoys lagged. Artillery batteries leapfrogged. Flanks thinned into ribbons of outposts. Somewhere, an enemy staff officer would decide where to strike. And when he did, the question was whether he'd strike the truth or the threat. In August 1944, eyes turned to the Brittany port of Brest, a German stronghold whose fortified harbor promised logistical salvation if taken, and costly attrition if mishandled. Real American divisions maneuvered to encircle the city. Meanwhile, the unusual soldiers received their order: hold the enemy's attention on places where no blow was coming. They arrived after dark. Trucks idled with their lamps hooded. Men moved in the smell of wet earth and livestock, speaking softly, heaving bulky packages to the ground. A compressor coughed to life. Canvas rustled. Lantern light traced arcs of brass fittings, rope, valves, pegs. Slowly, out of nothing, an army-shaped suggestion grew. Silhouettes, angles, the sordid clutter of a field force at rest. They knew how this landscape must look from the sky. A real armored unit yawns across a field in a particular way. Maintenance pits here, fuel drums there, a motor pool with its telltale scatter of parts and dark stains. So they laid tire tracks in patterns a pilot would understand at speed. They dragged heavy chains for the scuffs and gouges that happen when armored recovery vehicles do their work. On a ridge, they arranged what a distant optic would read as a battery of guns, and they gave that ridge the mess of life: cigarette tins, laundry lines, footprints that stopped where a tent should be. The next morning, a reconnaissance flight droned past. The camera shutters clicked. The film would be developed and handed to analysts who had seen too many tricks to be fools. And still, they would note a division's worth of activity where, the day before, nothing had stood. German commanders, already stretched, hesitated. That hesitation was time, and time was blood saved. The deception did not live by sight alone. The men understood the physics of sound, how the ground and the wind shape it, how temperature inversions carry it farther at dawn and dusk. They parked trucks behind hedgerows and sent a carefully mixed soundtrack of war rolling over the fields. Idling engines turning to revs and back again, the clank and rattle of armor, snatches of commands and the calm voices soldiers use when nothing is wrong. Miles away, a farmer paused in his chores to listen. Somewhere else, a sentry pricked up his ears and wrote a note he'd mention later. Rumor walked on. The radio teams played their own game. Their nets never sounded like parody. They sounded sloppy on purpose when a unit would be, and tight on purpose when it mattered. They used authentic call signs, authentic formats. They left the right kind of holes in the air, because real networks go quiet at certain hours and come alive at others. German intercept stations, sifting the ether, caught the pattern they expected to catch. A mosaic took shape. An enemy staff map grew a new set of arrows. The locals, too, were part of the invisible script. In cafes, men with the right patches on their sleeves and grease on their hands bought bread and asked for directions, letting a hint slip, the 6th Armored, as if it were nothing. That hint might land in the ear of a collaborator who would carry it to the wrong listener. None of this was accidental. None of it entirely safe. The performance held. Real divisions moved while the enemy stared at phantoms. September raised the stakes in Luxembourg. The U.S. 4th Armored Division needed to leave quietly and move north. If the Germans sensed the departure, they might punch through a soft sector. The strange unit arrived to become the 4th Armored, not in strength, but in impression. They replaced signboards at crossroads with official-looking arrows and unit markers. They painted insignia on vehicles with the wear and smudge of the real thing. They organized visible depots, stacks of crates and fuel drums set exactly where aerial cameras liked to find them. They built a headquarters that felt busy from a distance. The churn of vehicles, clerks coming and going, the posture of men who have too little time before a mission. From a hillside, through binoculars, an enemy scout would see nothing impossible. Merely the ordinary machinery of a division that was, in fact, already gone. The danger edged close. Patrols strayed within rifle range. A plane circled too long. Once, a local boy wandered near a shape that should not be touched and was gently turned away by a soldier who spoke enough of the language to be kind but firm. At night, the hiss of air and the faint creak of canvas made the men feel like they were living inside a secret that a pin could burst. They slept lightly. The payoff arrived in enemy paperwork. German estimates kept the 4th Armored in place for days that did not exist. Those days let real Allied units refuel, dig in, and prepare to fight when and where they chose. The ledger showed no trophies, only time, measured in bridges reinforced and casualties not taken. By autumn's end, the unit's craft had become a discipline. They learned when to underplay. A Real outfit doesn't always look busy. Sometimes it slouches. They learned when to overplay. Before an attack, soldiers suddenly find urgent reasons to move around. They built camps with the right number of cook fires, placed mess tents downwind so smoke drifted the way it should, parked vehicles where ruts would pool with rain just the way ruts do. It was 1,000 small truths arranged in one big lie. Winter was coming, and with it, the test that would either validate the strange weapon forever or expose it to ruin. December 1944 brought the kind of cold that bites through wool and pride alike. Snow lay thick in the Ardennes, a region everyone called a quiet sector, a place to rest battered units and rotate in replacements. Quiet sectors sometimes become killing grounds. Before dawn on a fog-choked morning, the woods erupted. The Germans were coming, and not in penny packets. Columns of armor and infantry, artillery rolling with them, staff plans sharpened to a knife's edge. It was Hitler's last throw, the Battle of the Bulge. Panic is a contagious thing. Roads jammed with refugees and supply trucks, units retreating in good order until they weren't. Radios spat fragments, some true, some wild. Pockets of resistance held and vanished and held again. Somewhere behind that storm of steel, a decision was made to call in the men who specialized in changing what the enemy believed. Their task was not to stop tanks with rifles. It was to convince German reconnaissance, and the officers behind it, that fresh American reserves had arrived where none existed. If that belief held, even for a day, even for 8 hours, it could bend the shape of the offensive. They slipped into forest clearings and farm lots that had not held troops the night before. The cold fought them. Equipment cracked. Fingers stiffened. Canvas turned reluctant. Yet in the gloom, patterns took form. The posture of a battalion lagered for the night. The alignment of vehicles a sergeant would demand. The footprints that tell the story of men with tasks. They thought not like magicians, but like sergeants. Sound crews studied the wind, because sound is a weather event. They placed their trucks where valleys would carry a low, believable thunder for miles. Not the blare of a gramophone, but the murmur of life. Engines idling, gears whining on slopes, a shouted name, a clatter of tools. Not constant, rhythmic. War has rhythms, and men who fake it must keep time. Radio operators wove conversations at a tempo that fit the supposed units they were imitating. The night before an attack, nets chatter less, not more. Officers keep their mouths shut. Brief bursts replace long yarns. They simulated that silence as carefully as they simulated speech. Intercept posts on the German side, already drowning in a flood of emergency traffic, noted enough familiar patterns to report what their superiors wanted to hear. They're here. Daylight gave the deception shape. Tracks scarred snowy roads where none had been. The edges of fields showed the churn of vehicles turning in. Tents speckled a woodline in numbers that matched a regiment's presence. A patrol might see the edges of all that and feel the prickle of caution that keeps men alive. There's something big there. Maybe not today. The risk bled into every hour. A German patrol drifting too close. A shelling that wandered into the wrong grid. A curious pair of eyes that kept looking. Soldiers later remembered freezing in place as boots crunched past on the other side of a hedge. They remembered the weight of silence in their throats, the way a breath felt like it might give them away. They were close enough to hear real tank engines somewhere else and to know that if those engines turned toward them, they had nothing but courage and poor cover. Yet the illusion held long enough. In a campaign where rumors slashed like knives, the enemy staff took the wrong lesson from the evidence it had. Units pivoted to face a shape in the snow. An artillery mission shifted to a coordinate that did not matter. The Allied counterattack gathered strength and time, always time, changed hands. When the German thrust finally blunted against towns that refused to yield and against a logistics machine that learned to breathe again, the men who had bought hours with shadows did what they always did. They took it all down. The forest unmade their work in a night. Prints filled with wind-blown snow, tire ruts softened, tents erased. The set vanished and the war moved east. They had not ended the battle, but they had bent it, and sometimes that is the difference between a disaster and a hard-earned victory. By March 1945, the Allied armies stood on the western bank of the Rhine, a river as much myth as geography, the last deep moat before Germany's heartland. The bridges were blown. The far bank bristled. To cross under fire is to wager blood against water and iron. Allied planners intended to multiply the odds with every advantage they could conjure, including the oldest advantage in war, making the enemy look the wrong way. The strange unit's culminating act unfolded in the lower Rhine sector. While real assault forces prepared for their crossing under cover of darkness and smoke, the deception men built the picture of a different crossing. Camp geometries, road signs, supply dumps, fuel parks, all the circumstantial evidence that convinces a distant eye. They simulated the presence of named divisions with markings that would pass a camera's glance. They parked bridging trucks where a photo interpreter would expect to see them. At night, the countryside throbbed with the sounds of carpenters' hammers, winches, engines, the industrial music of a river assault that would never come. Radio nets hummed with disciplined brevity, the way engineer units sound when there is too much to do. Patrols staged little tableaus at dawn. A reconnaissance jeep at a crossroads, a quartermaster truck bogged just enough to be plausible, a dozen men wrestling with a coil of cable. You could glimpse it and keep driving and still later be sure you'd seen what you thought you saw. From the air, the illusion stitched itself into the wider fabric of the front. Roads showed fresh where more tracks coming than going, as if units were feeding into a jump-off area. Fields held rows of something that looked like pontoons under tarps. Smoke from cook fires lightly veiled a camp whose size matched the paper strength of a division. Not heroic, not cinematic, just right. German analysts flagged the sector as dangerous. Commanders shifted reserves to meet a blow. When the real blow fell elsewhere, assault forces raced across water that was less contested than it might have been. The river did not forgive, it never does, but the butcher's bill was lower than the maps had predicted. The bridgeheads widened. The front cracked. Germany lay open. They packed again as ever. No trophies to parade, no prisoners to count. Only the quiet mathematics of lives spared. Artillery batteries that did not fire at the real crossing because they were waiting for the wrong one. Companies that were not mowed down because enemy reserves had been sent to chase a rumor. By war's end, the men had carried out more than 20 deception missions across France, Luxembourg, Belgium, and Germany. Their work never replaced the need for courage or firepower. It reduced the cost of both. If a battalion did not have to fight through a town because the enemy marched to the wrong drum, someone's son went home who otherwise would not have. For decades, almost no one knew. The files sat behind locks. Veterans kept their promise. They said little. Historians glimpsed oddities, photographs where some tanks looked too clean, after-action reports that credited deception units without names. But the story was mostly a rumor of a rumor. When records finally emerged, a shape came into focus. A small, disciplined American unit had used art, sound, and radiocraft to corral a ruthless enemy into fighting the wrong battles. Some of the men went on to fame, their wartime skills folding back into peacetime careers: fashion, painting, photography, architecture. Others lived quietly, the way people do who have carried a secret that once mattered tremendously. All of them had learned the same severe lesson, that credibility is a weapon, and that the surest way to build it is to follow the patterns of reality so closely that even your lies have the texture of truth. There is a picture that captures the paradox. Dawn on a field that held an army yesterday. Mist in the hollows, dew like sequins on grass. A rectangle of flattened earth where a gun had stood. Tire ruts that end at nothing. A coffee tin kicked into mud. Birds. The place is ordinary again, almost bored with itself. And yet, in that ordinariness lies the proof of what was done. A battle shaped by absence, by forces that existed only long enough to change a mind on the other side of a river. Wars are fought with steel and courage. They are won with those things and with imagination. The men who practiced this quiet craft were soldiers in every sense that matters. They stood in harm's way and accepted a peculiar charge, to save lives by pretending, to risk discovery without recourse to equal violence, to succeed so perfectly that no one would notice until long after the guns fell silent. They were actors in uniform, artists on the battlefield, engineers of misdirection and caretakers of a dangerous kind of hope. They were soldiers of an army that never truly existed, and because it never truly existed, it helped bring the war to an end. The Ghost Army.